The semester had just begun, and the campus was alive with the buzz of new beginnings. I was a transfer student, eager to carve out my place in the university's hallowed halls. The dormitory, an aging brick building covered in ivy, had seen better days, but it was the only place I could afford. When I was assigned room 404, the resident advisor gave me a strange look, almost as if he wanted to say something but decided against it. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my overactive imagination. Room 404 was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway, the kind of hallway that seemed to stretch on forever, with each step echoing ominously off the walls. As I approached the door, a chill crept up my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. I was being ridiculous. The door creaked open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished room, a single bed with a thin mattress, a wooden desk with a wobbly chair, and a closet that smelled faintly of mildew. It wasn't much, but it was home for the next year. The first few nights were uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air in room 404 was different, heavier, almost suffocating. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, and I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, heart racing, without knowing why. But I chalked it up to the stress of the new semester and the strange atmosphere of the old building. One night, about a week after I moved in, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first I thought it was a dream, but as my senses sharpened, I realized the whispers were real. They were faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A chorus of hushed voices, murmuring just beyond the edge of comprehension. I strained to listen, but the words were too garbled, too elusive to make out. I sat up in bed, my eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. Just the darkness pressing in from all sides. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or the pipes groaning in the walls. But the whispers persisted, night after night. Each time they grew louder, more insistent, until they were impossible to ignore. Sleep became a distant memory as I lay awake, listening to the voices that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. I told my roommate, a guy named Mike who lived in another building, but he just laughed it off, saying I was probably just hearing people in the hallway or the room next door. But there was no room next door. Room 404 was at the end of the hall, with only a wall separating it from the outside world. The whispers had no place to come from. Things escalated quickly after that. I began seeing things out of the corner of my eye, flickers of movement that disappeared when I turned my head. My belongings would move around on their own. I'd leave my textbooks on the desk only to find them scattered across the floor when I returned. The closet door, which I always kept closed, would be slightly ajar every morning, as if someone had been inside during the night. I was being toyed with, but by what, I couldn't say. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late and I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus on an essay that was due the next day. The room was silent, save for the scratching of my pen on paper. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the air became so cold I could see my breath. The light overhead flickered, casting the room in a sickly yellow hue. I felt a presence behind me, something dark and malevolent. I didn't want to turn around, but some unseen force compelled me to do so. Standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the light, was a figure. It was tall, its form shrouded in shadows that seemed to pulse and writhe like a living thing. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the figure, unable to move, unable to speak. The whispers started up again, louder than ever, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. But this time I could understand them. "Get out!" The command was clear, repeated over and over by the chorus of voices. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure in the corner began to move slowly, deliberately, stepping closer with each passing second. I could feel the air grow colder, the shadows darker as it approached. Just when it seemed like the figure would reach out and touch me, the door to my room flew open, slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. The figure vanished, and the whispers ceased. I was alone again, the only sound the rapid pounding of my heart in my ears. I bolted from the room, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air under the pale light of the moon. I didn't go back inside that night. Instead, I wandered the campus, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? The next day, I decided to find out more about room 404. I went to the library and started digging through old records, hoping to uncover some explanation for the strange occurrences. What I found chilled me to the bone. Room 404 had a history, one that stretched back decades. It was a history of tragedy and death. According to the records, a student had died in that room many years ago under mysterious circumstances. The official report claimed it was a suicide, but there were rumors of something more sinister. Witnesses reported hearing screams coming from the room the night before the body was found, and strange marks were discovered on the walls. Marks that looked like they had been made by claws. After that incident, room 404 was sealed off for a time, but eventually the school reopened it, assigning it to unsuspecting students like me, and the stories didn't stop. Over the years, there were numerous reports of strange occurrences, whispers in the night, objects moving on their own, and shadowy figures lurking in the corners. Some students claimed to have seen the ghost of the dead student, a figure shrouded in darkness, just like the one I had seen. I knew I couldn't stay in that room any longer, but I also knew I couldn't just leave without confronting whatever it was that haunted room 404. I needed answers, and there was only one place to find them. That night, I returned to room 404, armed with a flashlight and a voice recorder. I didn't know what I was hoping to capture, but I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. The room was as I had left it, cold and dark, with an oppressive atmosphere that made it hard to breathe. I sat on the bed, flashlight in hand, and waited. For hours, nothing happened. The room remained silent, the shadows still. I began to doubt myself, wondering if I had imagined everything. But then, just as I was about to give up, the temperature dropped again, and the whispers returned. This time they were different. They didn't tell me to get out. Instead, they seemed to be asking for something, begging for help. The voices were pleading, desperate, and I felt a surge of sympathy for whatever tortured souls were trapped in this place. "Who are you?" I whispered into the darkness. "What do you want?" The room fell silent, and for a moment I thought they weren't going to answer. But then, the voice recorder in my hand crackled to life, and a single word echoed through the small speaker. "Help!" Before I could react, the closet door slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. The shadows in the room coalesced, forming the figure once again, more defined and menacing than before. It stepped out of the closet, moving with unnatural speed, and this time, there was no escape. The door to my room slammed shut, trapping me inside with whatever malevolent force inhabited room 404. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest until I hit the wall. The figure loomed over me, its dark form blotting out the light. The whispers grew louder, filling my head with a relentless torrent of voices. I could feel my sanity slipping away, the darkness closing in. Then, just as I thought it was all over, the figure spoke, its voice a guttural rasp that chilled me to the core. "You can't leave." The room spun, and the world went black. I awoke to darkness. My head throbbed, and my body felt heavy, as though something was pressing down on me, suffocating me. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I had gotten there. But then, the memory of the figure in the shadows came rushing back, and I jolted upright, heart pounding in my chest. The room was still pitch black, the air thick with an oppressive silence. My flashlight had rolled across the floor, its beam casting a faint, flickering light on the far wall. I scrambled for it, feeling the cold wood beneath my fingers, and clutched it like a lifeline. The room was empty. No figure, no voices, just the lingering sense that I was not alone. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the voice recorder, desperate to hear what it had captured. The device was still on, its tiny screen glowing softly in the dark. I rewound the tape to the point just before I lost consciousness and pressed play. At first, there was nothing but the sound of my own voice, shaky and fearful, asking the questions that had seemed so important at the time. Then the whispers began, faint and indistinct. but growing louder with each passing second. And then, clear as day, a single word: help. I heard the crash of the closet door, the scuffle of feet, and my own panicked breathing. But it wasn't until the very end that I heard something new, something that sent a chill down my spine. A voice different from the guttural rasp I had heard before, faint and sorrowful. A girl's voice filled with pain and desperation, whispering through the crackling static of the recorder. "They won't let me go." I dropped the recorder, my breath hitching in my throat. The voice was so full of sorrow, so human, that it cut through the fear, leaving me with a deep, gnawing sense of dread. The figure in the shadows, the ghost, it wasn't just some malevolent entity. It was a girl, someone who had suffered, someone who was trapped. But who? And why? The answers I knew lay in the past, in the tragedy that had stained room 404 so many years ago. I had read about the student who died, but the records were vague, glossing over the details as if they were too terrible to be spoken aloud. But now I understood that there was more to the story, something darker, something the university had tried to bury. I had to know the truth. The next day I skipped my classes and returned to the library, determined to uncover the secrets of room 404. I spent hours poring over old newspaper clippings, yearbooks, anything I could find that might shed light on the mystery. And finally, in an old dusty archive, I found what I was looking for. The student who had died in room 404 was named Emily Hartford. She had been a bright, promising sophomore, majoring in literature. But her life had ended tragically one cold winter night when she was found dead in her room. The official report listed her death as a suicide, but rumors swirled around the campus for years. Some whispered that Emily had been murdered, that she had been raped and then killed by someone close to her, someone the university had protected. The more I dug, the more I found to support these rumors. Witnesses spoke of seeing Emily with a man in the weeks leading up to her death, a man who was never identified. There were accounts of her being withdrawn, frightened, as if she knew something terrible was going to happen. But the most chilling detail was this. Her body had been found in the closet, the very same closet that had slammed open on me the night before. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. Emily's death had been no accident. She had been raped and murdered, and her spirit, filled with rage and sorrow, had been trapped in room 404 ever since. The whispers, the shadows, the cold, everything I had experienced was Emily, reaching out from beyond the grave, begging for someone to hear her, to help her find peace. But how could I help her? What could I possibly do to free a spirit so tortured, so consumed by pain? I knew there was only one way to find out. That night I returned to room 404, armed not with a flashlight or a voice recorder, but with the knowledge of Emily's story and a determination to set her free. The room was just as I had left it, dark and foreboding, but I no longer felt the same fear. Instead, I felt a deep, overwhelming sadness for the girl who had suffered so much and had been forgotten by the world. I stood in the center of the room, my voice trembling as I called out into the darkness. "Emily? Emily, I know what happened to you. I know you were hurt. I'm here to help you." At first, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. But then, the temperature dropped and the whispers returned, soft and mournful. I could feel her presence, a cold, sorrowful weight in the room, and I knew she was listening. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you. You didn't deserve it, no one did. But you don't have to stay here anymore. You don't have to be trapped." The room seemed to shudder, the shadows deepening as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. I could hear the pain in them, the desperation, and I felt it like a knife in my chest. But I pressed on, knowing that this was the only way to reach her. "You can leave, Emily," I said, my voice stronger now. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. Whoever did this to you, they can't hurt you anymore. You're free." The room was alive with movement now, the shadows swirling around me like a storm. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard her voice again, clear, strong, and filled with a desperate hope. "Help me! I didn't know how to help her. I didn't know if I could, but I reached out, my hand trembling as I placed it on the closet door, the very place where her life had been cruelly snuffed out. "I'm here, Emily," I whispered. "I'm here." For a moment, everything went still. The whispers ceased, the shadows froze, and the air was heavy with anticipation. And then slowly, the closet door began to creak open. I braced myself for the worst, expecting the dark figure to emerge once more. But instead, the light from the hallway spilled into the room, and in that light, I saw her. Emily. She was just as the records described, a young girl, barely 20, with long dark hair and sad, haunted eyes. She stood in the doorway, her form translucent, shimmering like a mirage. But there was no malice in her gaze, only a deep, aching sorrow. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "help me." Tears streamed down my face as I nodded, my heart breaking for her. "I will," I promised. "I'll help you." Her gaze softened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of peace in her eyes. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch mine. Her fingers were cold, so cold, but there was a warmth in her touch that I hadn't expected. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the light. The room grew warmer, the shadows retreating, and I knew that she was finally leaving this place, finally free. As her presence faded, I heard her voice one last time, a soft whisper that filled the room with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. "Thank you." And then she was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart heavy with a mix of sadness and relief. The room was silent now, the air lighter, almost peaceful. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted room 404 for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred. Emily was gone, finally at peace, and I knew that room 404 would never be the same. I left the dormitory the next morning, not because I was afraid, but because I felt that my time there was done. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? But I knew the truth, and that was enough. As I walked away from the old brick building, I felt a sense of closure, not just for myself, but for Emily. Her story, once buried in the darkness, had finally been told. And though the memory of room 404 would stay with me forever, I knew that her spirit had finally found the peace she deserved. The shadows that had once filled that room had lifted, and the whispers had been silenced. Emily was free, and so was I.